May 22nd, 1946. Pankrác Prison, Prague, Czechoslovakia. A man stands in a courtyard, staring up at a specially constructed gallows. In less than an hour, he'll be dead, hanged in front of thousands of witnesses who've gathered to watch him die. But this isn't happening in some hidden execution chamber. This is happening on a hill overlooking Prague, in full view of the public. And the man about to die? He was one of the most brutal Nazi leaders in occupied Europe, responsible for the deaths of over 350,000 people. His name was Karl Hermann Frank. And what makes his execution extraordinary isn't just the crimes he committed. It's that the Czechs built special gallows just for him, positioned so that everyone in Prague could see justice being done. They wanted the world to watch. They wanted him to know, in his final moments, that an entire nation had gathered to witness his death. This is the story of a man who thought he was untouchable, who believed his power would last forever, and who learned, in the most public way possible, that history never forgets. But here's what will really disturb you about Karl Hermann Frank. He wasn't some fanatical ideologue who believed in Nazi racial theories. He was a bureaucrat, a paper pusher who discovered that genocide could be organized like any other administrative task. And that cold, calculated approach to mass murder made him more dangerous than 1,000 screaming fanatics. Because Frank proved something terrifying. You don't need to hate to kill. You just need to not care. September 24th, 1898. Carlsbad, Bohemia, then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. A baby boy was born into a middle-class Sudeten-German family. They named him Karl Hermann Frank. His father was a lawyer, respected in the community. His mother came from a family of civil servants. Young Karl grew up in comfort, surrounded by books and expectations. He was a bright child, studious, methodical. Teachers praised his attention to detail, his ability to organize information, his systematic approach to problems. He wasn't particularly charismatic. He didn't have many friends. But he was efficient. And in the world he was about to enter, efficiency would be valued above all else. World War I shattered Karl's comfortable childhood. His father served in the Austrian army. The family struggled. And when the war ended, everything Karl had known disappeared. The Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed. Suddenly, the Franks found themselves living in a new country, Czechoslovakia. And the Sudeten Germans, who had been the ruling class, were now a minority in a Slavic nation. Karl never forgave the Czechs for this. In his mind, they had stolen his birthright, his rightful place in the world. This resentment would fester for decades, growing into something monstrous. After the war, Frank studied law and publishing. He was a mediocre student, but persistent. He graduated in 1923 and opened a small bookshop in Carlsbad. For years, he lived an unremarkable life, selling books, barely making ends meet. He married a woman named Karola. They had children. From the outside, Karl Hermann Frank looked like just another struggling shopkeeper. But inside, the resentment was building. He felt cheated by history, diminished by circumstances beyond his control. And he was looking for someone to blame. In 1919, Frank joined the German National Socialist Workers' Party in Czechoslovakia. This wasn't Hitler's party yet, just a collection of angry Sudeten Germans who wanted autonomy. Frank found his people, men who shared his grievances, who believed the Czechs had stolen what was rightfully theirs. He wasn't a leader yet. He was just another angry voice in the crowd. But he was patient, he was organized, and he was waiting for his moment. That moment came in 1933, when Adolf Hitler seized power in Germany. Suddenly, being a Nazi wasn't just acceptable, it was powerful. Frank watched as Hitler transformed Germany, and he wanted that same transformation for the Sudetenland. He joined the Sudeten German Party, led by Konrad Henlein. This party was openly pro-Nazi, demanding that the Sudetenland be incorporated into Germany. And Frank, with his organizational skills and his cold efficiency, quickly rose through the ranks. By 1935, Frank was Henlein's deputy, the number 2 man in the Sudeten German Party. He organized rallies, coordinated propaganda, built the party infrastructure. He wasn't a fiery speaker like Hitler. He was the man behind the scenes, making sure everything ran smoothly, making sure the trains ran on time, so to speak. And Hitler noticed. The Führer liked efficient men who could turn ideology into action without getting distracted by emotion. September 1938, the Munich Agreement. Britain and France, desperate to avoid war, handed the Sudetenland to Hitler on a silver platter. Czechoslovakia wasn't even invited to the negotiations. Their country was carved up by foreign powers, and there was nothing they could do about it. German troops marched into the Sudetenland on October 1, 1938. And Karl Hermann Frank marched with them. After 20 years of resentment, he was finally on the winning side. The Czechs who had ruled over him were now at his mercy, and Frank had no mercy to give. Hitler appointed Frank as the State Secretary of the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. This was the rump of Czechoslovakia that remained after the Sudetenland was taken. Frank's job was simple: suppress Czech resistance, exploit the country's resources for the German war effort, and eliminate anyone who stood in the way. Frank approached this task with the same methodical efficiency he'd brought to his bookshop. Except now, instead of organizing inventory, he was organizing oppression. March 15, 1939. German troops occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. The country ceased to exist. In its place, the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, a puppet state completely controlled by Nazi Germany. And Karl Hermann Frank was one of its most powerful officials. He set up his headquarters in Prague Castle, the ancient seat of Czech kings. The symbolism was deliberate. The Czechs were conquered. Their history meant nothing. Frank was in charge now. His first actions revealed the kind of administrator he would be. He established a network of informants throughout Prague, neighbors spying on neighbors, workers reporting on colleagues. Anyone suspected of anti-German sentiment was arrested. The Gestapo, under Frank's direction, conducted raids almost nightly. Thousands of Czechs were imprisoned in the first months of occupation. Many were never seen again. But Frank wasn't acting out of passion or hatred. He was following a system: arrest, interrogate, categorize, dispose. It was bureaucratic murder, organized and efficient. The Czech resistance began almost immediately. Underground newspapers appeared. Sabotage disrupted German operations, and Frank's response was calculated and brutal. For every act of resistance, there would be reprisals, not random violence, but systematic terror designed to break the Czech spirit. He issued orders. For every German killed, 100 Czechs would be executed. For every act of sabotage, entire villages would be punished. He put these orders in writing, signed them, filed them properly. Murder as administrative policy. September 27, 1941. Reinhard Heydrich arrived in Prague as the new Reich protector, Frank's superior. Heydrich was one of the architects of the Holocaust, a man so cruel that even other Nazis called him the Butcher of Prague. Frank should have been threatened by Heydrich's arrival. Instead, he saw an opportunity. Heydrich had the vision. Frank had the organizational skills. Together they would crush Czech resistance once and for all. The Heydrich-Frank partnership was terrifyingly effective. They declared martial law. Mass arrests swept through Prague. The Gestapo, with Frank's meticulous records, knew exactly who to target. intellectuals, teachers, former military officers, anyone who might lead resistance. Within weeks, thousands were arrested. Hundreds were executed. The executions were public, bodies displayed as warnings. Frank personally reviewed the execution lists, adding names, removing others based on his systematic analysis of who posed the greatest threat. But Frank's greatest crime was yet to come. May 27th, 1942. Czech resistance fighters, trained in Britain, ambushed Heydrich's car in Prague. They threw a bomb. Heydrich was wounded. He would die 8 days later from his injuries. And Karl Hermann Frank, now acting Reich protector, was about to show the world what systematic terror really meant. Frank's response to Heydrich's assassination was methodical genocide. He didn't lash out in anger. He planned, he organized, he created a system for revenge. First, he ordered the arrest of 10,000 Czechs. Not specific suspects, just 10,000 people grabbed off the streets, from their homes, from their workplaces. They were processed through interrogation centers that Frank had established. Most were sent to concentration camps. Hundreds were executed immediately. But that wasn't enough for Frank. He wanted to send a message that would echo through history. He wanted to prove that resistance was futile, that the cost of defying Germany was absolute destruction. So he chose a target, the village of Lidice. Intelligence, probably false, suggested that the assassins had connections to Lidice. It didn't matter if it was true. Frank needed a demonstration. And Lidice would be that demonstration. June 10th, 1942. German forces surrounded Lidice, a small mining village of about 500 people. Frank's orders were explicit and detailed. Every man over 16 was to be shot. Every woman was to be sent to Ravensbrück concentration camp. Every child was to be evaluated for Germanization. Those who looked German enough would be adopted by German families. The rest would be killed. And the village itself was to be completely destroyed, erased from the map as if it had never existed. The massacre began at dawn. The men of Lidice, 173 of them, were lined up in groups of 10 against the wall of a farm. SS troops, following Frank's orders, shot them systematically. 10 men, reload, 10 more men, reload. It took hours. The bodies were buried in a mass grave. The women, 184 of them, were loaded onto trucks and sent to Ravensbrück. Most would die there. The children, 82 of them, were taken to a facility where SS doctors examined them. 8 children were deemed suitable for Germanization. The other 74 were sent to Chelmno extermination camp and gassed. Then came the final phase of Frank's plan. German engineers demolished every building in Lidice. Houses, the church, the school, everything. They used explosives and bulldozers. They filled in the village pond. They even dug up the cemetery and destroyed the headstones. When they were finished, they planted crops over the ruins. Frank wanted Lidice to disappear completely, as if the village and its people had never existed. And he documented everything. Photographs, reports, detailed accounts. Because Frank was a bureaucrat, and bureaucrats keep records. But Frank wasn't done. 2 weeks later, he ordered the same treatment for another village, Ležáky. Every adult was executed. The children were sent to concentration camps. The village was destroyed. Frank's message was clear. This is what happens when you resist. This is the price of defiance. And he delivered this message with cold, administrative efficiency. No rage, no passion, just systematic destruction. The Lidice massacre shocked the world. Even in the middle of a brutal war, the complete annihilation of a village was extraordinary. The Allies condemned it. The Czech government in exile in London vowed revenge. And Karl Hermann Frank's name became synonymous with Nazi brutality. But Frank didn't care about world opinion. He cared about results. And from his perspective, Lidus was a success. Czech resistance was severely weakened. The population was terrorized into submission. Mission accomplished. For the next 3 years, Frank continued his systematic oppression of Czechoslovakia. He oversaw the deportation of Czech Jews to extermination camps. Over 80,000 Czech Jews were murdered in the Holocaust, and Frank's signature was on many of the deportation orders. He organized forced labor programs, sending hundreds of thousands of Czechs to work in German factories. He suppressed Czech culture, closing universities, banning Czech language publications, arresting anyone who celebrated Czech history or identity. And through it all, Frank maintained his bureaucratic approach. He held regular meetings. He filed reports. He kept meticulous records of arrests, deportations, executions. He ran the occupation of Czechoslovakia like a business, with quotas and efficiency metrics. The only product was suffering, and Frank was an excellent manager. But Frank wasn't just following orders from Berlin. He was an innovator in oppression. He developed new techniques for identifying resistance members, using cross-referenced databases before computers existed. He created mobile execution units that could respond quickly to any act of resistance. He established a system of collective punishment that made entire communities responsible for individual actions. Other Nazi administrators studied Frank's methods and implemented them in their own territories. He was, in the most horrifying sense, a pioneer. By 1945, Frank had been in power in Czechoslovakia for 6 years. He had overseen the deaths of over 350,000 people: Czechs, Jews, Roma, political prisoners, resistance fighters. Some died in concentration camps. Some were executed. Some simply disappeared into the night and fog of Nazi terror. And Frank had documented most of it, creating a paper trail that would eventually lead to his own destruction. April 1945. The war was ending. Soviet forces were approaching from the east, American forces from the west. Nazi Germany was collapsing, and Karl Hermann Frank, who had wielded absolute power for 6 years, suddenly faced a choice: flee or fight. Some Nazi leaders committed suicide. Some tried to escape to South America. Frank did neither. He stayed in Prague, still issuing orders, still trying to maintain control even as his world crumbled around him. May 5, 1945. The Prague uprising began. Czech resistance fighters, emboldened by Germany's imminent defeat, rose up against their occupiers. They built barricades in the streets. They attacked German positions. And Frank, true to form, responded with systematic brutality. He ordered his remaining forces to crush the uprising. German troops fired on civilians. They used tanks against barricades. They executed prisoners. In the final days of the war, Frank was still killing Czechs. But it was too late. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Soviet forces entered Prague. The Czech flag flew over Prague Castle again. And Karl Hermann Frank, who had ruled from that castle for 6 years, was now a fugitive. He tried to escape, disguising himself as a common soldier. He made it about 50 miles before American forces captured him on May 9, 1945. When they searched him, they found his SS identification papers. He'd kept them, even in flight. The bureaucrat couldn't quite let go of his documentation. The Americans handed Frank over to Czech authorities. The Czechs had been waiting for this moment. They had a long list of charges: war crimes, crimes against humanity, the Lidus massacre, the murder of thousands of political prisoners, the deportation of Jews, the suppression of Czech culture. The evidence was overwhelming, much of it in Frank's own handwriting. The meticulous records he'd kept would now be used to convict him. The trial began on March 22, 1946, in Prague. Frank sat in the defendant's box, still maintaining his bureaucratic composure. He wore a suit. He took notes. He looked like a middle-aged accountant, not a mass murderer. But the evidence presented against him was damning beyond measure. Survivors testified about the terror he'd unleashed. Documents bearing his signature authorized mass executions. Photographs showed the ruins of Lidis. The prosecution built an airtight case. Frank's defense was predictable. He was following orders. He was serving his country. The harsh measures were necessary to maintain order. He claimed he'd actually protected Czechs from worse treatment, that without his administrative efficiency, the occupation would have been even more brutal. He showed no remorse, no recognition that he'd done anything wrong. In his mind, he'd simply been doing his job. The fact that his job involved mass murder was, to him, irrelevant. The trial lasted 2 months. Witness after witness described Frank's crimes. The judges heard testimony about Lidis, about the mass executions, about the deportations. They reviewed thousands of documents, each one revealing Frank's systematic approach to oppression. And through it all, Frank remained calm, occasionally objecting to procedural matters, treating his trial for genocide like a business meeting. May 22, 1946. The verdict: guilty on all counts. The judges found that Karl Hermann Frank had willfully and systematically murdered civilians, that he had organized and directed the Lidis massacre, that he had been instrumental in the deportation and murder of Czech Jews, and that he had committed crimes against humanity on a massive scale. For these crimes, he was sentenced to death by hanging. When the sentence was read, Frank showed no emotion. He simply nodded, as if confirming a business decision. But the Czechs weren't going to execute Frank quietly in some prison cell. They wanted the world to see. They wanted every Czech citizen to witness justice being done. So they made a decision that was unprecedented. Frank's execution would be public, held outdoors where thousands could watch. They chose a location carefully, a courtyard at Pankrác Prison, but with the gallows positioned on a hill so that people throughout Prague could see it. They wanted Frank's death to be visible, a symbol that the nightmare was finally over. The gallows were specially constructed for Frank's execution. They built them high, higher than necessary, so they would be visible from a distance. The platform was sturdy, designed to hold not just Frank, but also the officials who would oversee the execution. And the rope was tested multiple times to ensure it would work properly. The Czechs wanted no mistakes. This execution had to be perfect. May 22, 1946, Execution Day. Frank woke in his cell knowing what was coming. Guards reported that he'd slept poorly, pacing most of the night. But when morning came, he maintained his composure. He ate a small breakfast. He refused to see a priest. He dressed carefully in a dark suit, as if preparing for a business meeting. The bureaucrat, organized to the end. Outside Pankrác Prison, thousands of people had gathered. They lined the streets. They filled every vantage point that offered a view of the prison hill. Estimates suggest that over 5,000 people came to watch Karl Hermann Frank die. Some were survivors of his terror. Some had lost family members to his orders. Some were simply Czech citizens who wanted to see justice done. They waited in silence, a vast crowd united by a single purpose. At 10:30 a.m., the guards came for Frank. They led him from his cell through the prison corridors. Frank walked steadily, his face expressionless. He'd spent 6 years wielding power over life and death. Now that power belonged to someone else. The walk to the execution site took several minutes. Frank could hear the crowd outside, thousands of people waiting to watch him die. If it affected him, he didn't show it. The execution site was a courtyard, open to the sky. The gallows stood in the center, tall and stark against the morning light. Officials were present: the prison warden, legal observers, a doctor, and representatives of the Czech government. And beyond the prison walls, visible from the gallows, the crowd. Thousands of faces, all turned toward this moment. Frank was led up the steps to the platform. His hands were bound behind his back. He stood on the trap door, looking out over Prague, the city he'd terrorized for 6 years. The city that had survived him. The executioner was a Czech named Josef Vollschlager. He'd volunteered for this duty. He approached Frank with the noose. Standard procedure called for a hood to be placed over the condemned man's head, but Frank refused it. He wanted to face death with his eyes open. The officials allowed this, let him see what was coming. The noose was placed around Frank's neck, the knot positioned carefully behind his left ear. The rope was adjusted for his weight, 165 pounds. The drop was calculated, 8 feet, enough to break his neck instantly. Frank was given a chance to make a final statement. He declined. No apologies, no last words, no acknowledgement of his crimes. He simply stood there, noose around his neck, looking out at the crowd that had gathered to watch him die. The silence was profound. Thousands of people, completely quiet, waiting for justice. The executioner stepped back. He checked that everything was ready. The officials nodded. The doctor prepared to confirm death. And in that moment, Karl Hermann Frank, who had sent hundreds of thousands to their deaths with a signature and a stamp, finally understood what it meant to be powerless. The executioner pulled the lever. The trapdoor opened. Frank dropped 8 feet. The rope snapped taut. His neck broke instantly with an audible crack that echoed across the courtyard. His body jerked once, then hung still. Death was instantaneous. The meticulous planning had worked perfectly. Karl Hermann Frank was dead. The crowd outside erupted, not in celebration, but in a collective release of emotion. 6 years of occupation, 6 years of terror, 6 years of systematic oppression, and it was finally over. The man who had symbolized their suffering was dead, hanging from a rope on a hill overlooking Prague. Justice, delayed but not denied, had finally arrived. The doctor approached the hanging body. He checked for a pulse. Nothing. He listened for a heartbeat. Nothing. He waited the required time, then pronounced Karl Hermann Frank dead at 10:37 a.m., May 22, 1946. The body hung for several more minutes, visible to the crowd, a final confirmation that the nightmare was over. Then it was cut down and removed. Frank's body was taken to a mortuary where an autopsy was performed. The official cause of death was recorded as judicial hanging with instantaneous death due to cervical fracture. His body was then cremated, and his ashes were scattered in an undisclosed location. No grave, no marker, no memorial. Like Lidis, Karl Hermann Frank was erased from the landscape. But unlike Lidis, he would not be remembered with sympathy. The execution of Karl Hermann Frank was more than just punishment for one man's crimes. It was a statement by the Czech people that they had survived, that they had not been broken, that justice would prevail even after years of oppression. The public nature of the execution was deliberate. The Czechs wanted the world to see that Nazi criminals would be held accountable. They wanted future tyrants to know that history keeps records, that crimes will be punished, that no amount of power can protect you forever. But here's what we need to understand about Karl Hermann Frank. He wasn't an aberration. He wasn't some uniquely evil monster. He was a bureaucrat who discovered that his organizational skills could be applied to genocide. He proved that you don't need to be a raging fanatic to commit atrocities. You just need to be efficient, methodical, and willing to treat human lives as administrative problems to be solved. In many ways, Frank was more dangerous than the screaming ideologues because he made mass murder seem rational, systematic, normal. The Liddus massacre, Frank's signature crime, became a symbol of Nazi brutality. The village was eventually rebuilt after the war, but in a different location. The original site remains a memorial, a field of grass where a village once stood. Every year, thousands visit to remember what happened there, to honor the victims, and to remind themselves what humans are capable of when they stop seeing each other as human. Frank's meticulous records, the very documents he'd kept so carefully, became crucial evidence in understanding the Nazi occupation of Czechoslovakia. Historians have used his files to trace the fate of thousands of victims, to understand the systematic nature of Nazi oppression, to document crimes that might otherwise have been lost to history. The bureaucrat's obsession with documentation ensured that his crimes would never be forgotten. The survivors of Frank's terror carried his memory as a warning. They testified at his trial, they watched his execution, and they spent the rest of their lives telling their stories, ensuring that future generations would know what happened. Because the greatest danger isn't that we'll remember the monsters. It's that we'll forget how ordinary they seemed before they became monsters. Karl Hermann Frank was born into a comfortable middle-class family. He was educated. He was intelligent. He had a wife and children. He ran a bookshop. He was by all appearances a normal person. And then circumstances gave him power, and he used that power to kill hundreds of thousands of people. Not in a moment of passion, not in a fit of rage, but systematically, efficiently, bureaucratically. He organized genocide the way other people organize inventory. This is the lesson of Karl Hermann Frank. Evil doesn't always announce itself with dramatic speeches and grand gestures. Sometimes it arrives in a suit and tie, carrying a briefcase full of carefully organized files. Sometimes it speaks calmly and rationally about necessary measures and administrative efficiency. Sometimes it looks like a middle-aged bureaucrat doing his job. And that's what makes it so dangerous. The execution on that hill in Prague was justice, but it was also a warning. It said that no matter how systematic your crimes, no matter how carefully you document your atrocities, no matter how efficiently you organize oppression, justice will find you. It may take time, it may require the defeat of armies and the fall of empires, but it will come. And when it does, you'll stand on a trap door with a rope around your neck, facing the people you tried to destroy, learning in your final moments that history never forgets. Frank's death brought no one back. It didn't rebuild Liddus. It didn't reunite families torn apart by deportations. It didn't heal the trauma of 6 years of occupation. But it did one thing. It proved that even the most efficient, systematic, bureaucratic evil can be stopped. That the arc of history, however slowly, bends toward justice. That monsters, no matter how carefully they organize their crimes, will eventually face consequences. As Frank's body hung from that gallows on a hill overlooking Prague, visible to thousands of witnesses, it sent a message that echoed far beyond Czechoslovakia. It said that crimes against humanity will be punished, that following orders is not a defense, that efficiency in the service of evil is still evil, that bureaucrats who organize genocide are still murderers, and that justice, though it may be delayed, will eventually arrive. The crowd that gathered to watch Frank die wasn't celebrating violence. They were witnessing the end of a nightmare. They were seeing proof that their suffering had not been forgotten, that their dead would be avenged, that the man who had terrorized them for 6 years was finally powerless. And in that moment, as Frank's body swung from the rope, Prague began to heal. Karl Hermann Frank died believing he'd done nothing wrong. He went to his death convinced that he'd simply been an efficient administrator serving his country. He never acknowledged the humanity of his victims. He never showed remorse for the children gassed at Chelmno, for the men shot at Lidice, for the thousands who disappeared into concentration camps. He remained, to his final breath, a bureaucrat who had simply been doing his job. But history remembers him differently. History remembers Karl Hermann Frank as a war criminal, a mass murderer, a man who proved that systematic evil is still evil. His name is forever linked with Lidice, with the Holocaust in Czechoslovakia, with 6 years of brutal occupation. The efficiency he prided himself on is remembered only as a measure of his crimes. And his death, public and witnessed by thousands, stands as proof that justice, however delayed, eventually prevails. The gallows where Frank died were dismantled after his execution. The wood was burned. Nothing remains of the structure that ended his life. But the memory remains. The photographs remain. The testimony remains. And the lesson remains. That evil, no matter how well organized, will eventually face justice. That bureaucrats who serve tyranny will be held accountable. That history keeps records longer than any filing system. And that the arc of the moral universe, though long, bends toward justice. Karl Hermann Frank learned that lesson on May 22, 1946, as the trapdoor opened beneath his feet and gravity delivered the justice he'd denied to so many others. In that final moment, as the rope tightened and consciousness faded, the bureaucrat who had organized so much death finally became a statistic in his own ledger. One more body, one more name, one more reminder that evil, however systematic, eventually ends, and Prague, the city he'd terrorized, the city he'd tried to break, stood witness to his end. Thousands of eyes watched justice being done. Thousands of voices, silent in that moment, carried the memory forward. The nightmare was over. The monster was dead. And life, resilient and determined, would continue. That's the final lesson of Karl Hermann Frank's execution. That evil is temporary, but justice and memory are eternal.